Chapter 1 of The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 1 for Uncle Sam. Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their... It was that old practice sentence of typists, which is as old as our typewriting machines, and Joe Harned, seated before the old-style, noisy, but still capable machine in Philip Burton's telegraph office, had rattled it off 25 times and was on his 26th when suddenly, very suddenly, his mind began to work. Or rather it might be said that an idea, the big idea, danced unceremoniously into his brain, and, beginning to take definite and concrete form, chased a score of other smaller ideas through all the thought channels of his handsome, boyish, well-rounded head. He came to a full stop and gazed steadily at the upturned paper in the typewriter in front of him. 25 times he had written that sentence, and 25 times, with mechanical precision and true adherence to time-honored custom, he had finished it by tapping off the words "party." It was a formula of words which some genius had devised for the fingering practice it gave one on the keyboard, and Joe Harned had written it hundreds of times before, just as thousands of others had done, without giving a thought to its meaning, or the significance that a substitution of a single word would give it. He read it again, and, as if it were the result of an uncontrollable impulse, his fingers began the rapid tap, tap, tap. And this time he substituted the new word that the big idea had suddenly thrust into his mind. Joe gave the roller a twirl, the paper rolled out, dropped to the floor, and he grasped for it eagerly. Even Joe was surprised. He hadn't realized that in his enthusiastic haste he had pushed down the key marked caps. In bold, outstanding letters near the bottom of the sheet was an historic sentence, and Joe Harned of Brighton Academy had devised it. Now was the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Joe gazed at it again for a moment, and then let his eyes travel across the little office to where the red-headed, freckled-faced, big-hearted, and impetuous Jerry Macklin was rapping away at another typewriter, and 2 feet away from Jerry, Slim Goodwin, 170 pounds in his stocking feet and 5'4" in his gym suit, was working the telegraph key with a pudgy hand. "Jerry," he called. "Oh, Slim, come over here a moment, both of you. I want to show you something." Jerry immediately ceased typewriting, but Slim was reluctant to release the telegraph key. However, as Joe began folding the paper in such a way that only the last sentence showed, their aroused curiosity brought both of them to his side. "Read that," said Joe, trying to suppress the quiver in his voice and holding the paper up before them. "Read it carefully." One lad on either side of him, they hung over Joe's shoulder and followed his bidding. "Right!" shouted Jerry as he came to the last word. "Joe, you're a wizard! What you've written there is the truth." "Ain't it? I mean, isn't it?" added the delicate Slim Goodwin, and partly to hide his grammatical error, but mostly to express his enthusiasm, he gave Joe a 170-pound whack on the back that sent him sliding out of the chair and halfway under the typewriter table. "Say!" Joe remonstrated, but just then Philip Burton, telegraph operator and genial good friend of all 3 of the lads, bustled into the room, a sheaf of yellow telegrams in his hand. "What's all the excitement?" he asked, striding toward the typewriter just left by Jerry. "Why," explained Slim, "Joe's just done something that means something." "Impossible," said Mr. Burton, turning towards them with one of those irresistible smiles which long ago had made him the boys' confidant. "If you don't believe it, read this," commanded Jerry, thrusting the paper before the telegrapher's eyes. Mr. Burton read through it and turned to the 3 boys again. "Well?" he asked. "It means what it says," explained Jerry. "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country." "And we're good men, aren't we?" demanded Slim, drawing up his stomach and throwing out his chest as he straightened up to his full 5 feet 4 inches in his gym suit. "None better anywhere," said Mr. Burton in a tone that showed that he meant it. "But just how do you contemplate going to the aid of the country?" It was Joe's turn to say something, and he did. "By enlisting," he announced, briefly but firmly. "Yes," agreed Slim, "that is, by enlisting." "Uh-huh," said Jerry, nodding his head vigorously and watching Mr. Burton's face for the evidence of their decision. "And when did you determine upon that?" the telegrapher asked with increasing interest. "Well," said Slim, his face now painfully red from his efforts to keep his chest out and stomach in, "it was finally decided upon just now, although we have talked about the thing in a general way many times." "You really mean to enlist all three of you?" Mr. Burton demanded. "Yes, sir," they chorused, "all three." "Good!" exclaimed the man who had been their friend and helper. "Fine! I'm proud of you," and he proceeded to shake hands heartily with each in turn. "Have you decided upon the branch of the service you intend to enter?" he then asked. Joe looked at Jerry, Jerry looked at Slim, and Slim cast a helpless glance back at Joe. "I see you haven't," said Mr. Burton hastily, "and I'm glad of it. Now, how about the Signal Corps?" "What do men in the Signal Corps do?" asked Jerry. "Do they fight?" demanded Slim. "Yes," Mr. Burton replied. "They do some fighting on their own account, and often in tough places and against discouraging odds. But they do even more than that. Without their assistance, no general would dare lay plans for a battle. The Signal Corps keeps the commanders posted, not only as to the whereabouts and disposition of his own troops, but also those of the enemy. The Signal Corps is the telephone, the telegraph, the wireless, and often the aviation section as well, of the American Army, and often of the American Navy, too." "Isn't that great?" exclaimed the breathless Slim as Mr. Burton went over to the ticker to answer the code call for his station. During the 10 minutes that he was engaged in receiving and sending messages, the boys perfected plans for notifying their relatives of their intention. Had their attention not been so entirely taken by the subject under discussion, they would have seen Herbert Wallace, another and very unpopular student at Brighton, pass by the office window, stop for a moment to stare at him, and then step away quickly in the direction of the door near which they were standing. "Well, what's the verdict?" asked Mr. Burton, having finished his duties. "The Signal Corps is our choice," said Joe, speaking for all. "But how do we go about getting into it?" "I think I can arrange that," Mr. Burton informed them. "You boys have been studying telegraphy under me for more than 6 months, and I'm willing to certify that each of you can now handle an instrument. In addition to that, you're able to take down messages on the typewriter as they come over the wire." "Yes, sir," Mr. Burton finished. "I think your Uncle Sam will be mighty glad to get 3 such lads as you, and I know the recruiting agent to put the thing through." So it was arranged that the 3 lads should return to the dormitory, write letters which they were to procure them the desired permission to enlist, and inform the headmaster of their intentions. Joe and Jerry, who had roomed together throughout their entire 3 years at Brighton, already were well on with their epistles of explanation when Slim, whose room was 7 doors down the corridor, dragged himself in, looking more downcast than any boy in Brighton ever had seen him look before. "No use," he informed his friends, a choke in his voice. "They won't have me. I'm overweight." "Oh, now, Slim, what are you worrying about that for? I don't believe any such thing," counseled Joe. "It's true, though," affirmed Slim. "The worst part of it is, I saw it in a book. I'm toting around about 20 pounds more than the government wants, and I'd have to stand on tiptoe in high-heeled shoes to meet the requirement in height." Poor Slim! He showed his disappointment in every look and every action. "What kind of a book did you see it in?" asked Jerry, in a tone almost as sad as Slim's. "In the manual," Slim groaned. "Herb Wallace showed it to me." "That settles it," exclaimed Joe. "If Herb Wallace had a hand in it anywhere, there's something wrong. I'll tell you what we'll do, fellows. We'll go ask the headmaster." Now, the headmaster of Brighton had once been a boy himself. He could be stern, even cruelly severe, when occasion demanded, but he was kind of heart and broad of understanding. Before him the 3 lads laid their case as before the final tribunal. He said, when all the details had been related and the all-important information asked. "You say Herbert Wallace showed you this manual?" Slim solemnly affirmed that this was the case. The headmaster pushed a button on the side of his desk, and in a few seconds his secretary, a big bluff fellow, appeared. "Bring Herbert Wallace here at once," said the headmaster. In some 5 more minutes, while the headmaster was shrewdly questioning the 3 lads as to the seriousness of their determination to enlist, the secretary returned, accompanied by young Wallace, flushed and shamefaced. "Well, Wallace," said the principal of Brighton, "I hear you've been studying up on military subjects. Intending to get into the fight?" Herbert Wallace hung his head and muttered an unintelligible reply. "Now look here, Wallace," spoke the headmaster sternly, "where did you get the military manual from which you gave Goodwin the information that he could not pass the examination for the Army?" I got it from the library, sir." "Got it without permission, too, didn't you?" pursued the headmaster. "Yes, sir," said Wallace in confusion. "And didn't know it was out of date, and the requirements were completely changed after the United States entered this war, eh?" "No, sir," answered Wallace, on the verge of a breakdown. "I'll decide on your punishment later," announced the headmaster. "See me here at 4 o'clock. Meanwhile, Wallace, be careful where you get your information, and be careful how you dispense it." And Herbert Wallace, utterly humiliated, was glad to flee from the room. "I don't think," said the headmaster, "that any of you will have difficulty in passing the examinations. I dislike to see you go, but you speak the truth when you say that your country does need you, and I pay a great tribute of respect to you for the patriotism and the courage with which you step forward to shoulder your obligations. Others have already gone from Brighton, still others will go in the future. God bless all of you, and may you return safe and sound to reap the full benefits of the democracy for which you're going to fight." The suspicion of tears dimmed the kindly eyes of the headmaster, and each boy choked up as he bade him good-bye. But, after all, this was no time for sadness. Young gladiators are going forth to the fray, and so we will skip over the farewells the following day, in which the parents of each lad, with many a heartache but never a word of discouragement, bade the boys Godspeed in the service of their country. The 3 lads, together with 15 others, formed a detachment of the recently enlisted who were ready to go to the Philadelphia Navy Yard for further assignment. Just before the train pulled out, a students' parade that seemed to include every boy in Brighton marched to the station to see them off. One of the lads carried a large transparency on which was printed, "They brighten the fame of Brighton." And just as the train pulled out, and there was a great cheering and waving of hats and handkerchiefs, Joe, Jerry, and Slim, leaning out from adjoining windows, sang out in chorus, "For Uncle Sam." End of chapter 1.